there is a voice you have heard before. You may not know the name of the man it belonged to. You may not know what it cost him to find it, but somewhere, in a dark room, on a screen, through a speaker at the edge of sleep, that voice reached you. And something in you recognized it, not as a character, not as a hero, as someone who understood what it meant to live behind a mask. Tonight, we follow that voice, all the way back to where it came from. Tonight, friend, you have found Mr. K. Law. This is the quiet broadcast where the great characters of our time are remembered slowly and remembered fully. I am the keeper of their stories. You are the listener who does not need them to hurry. Before we begin, leave a thought below. Tell me, whose voice do you hear when you think of Batman? And if you would like to find me again, the subscribe button is there. The light is low, the night is long, and the story is ready. Bruce, later known as Batman, and the man who would one day give him a voice. Kevin Conroy, born in Westbury, New York, on the 30th of November, 1955. Every great story begins with something being taken away, not something small, not a misunderstanding, not a setback, not a door that closed in the wrong season. Something permanent, something witnessed, something that does not heal so much as calcify, hardening slowly over years into the shape of the person you become. The wound does not disappear, it becomes the architecture. Bruce Wayne's wound has a location. It has a name, though that name was not given to it until long after the event. Crime Alley, a narrow street in the older part of Gotham City, where the cobblestones are uneven and the gas lamp. In the world that holds this story, throw more shadow than light. A father, a mother, a boy in his Sunday clothes, a man with a gun who wanted a pearl necklace and did not care what he had to do to get it. 2 shots, 2 bodies, and a boy on his knees in the dark, making a promise to the dead that would take the rest of his life to keep. That scene did not exist in March of 1939, when the character first appeared in print. Batman debuted in Detective Comics issue 27, a 10-cent publication that hit newsstands on the 30th of that month. As a grown man, already in the cape, already in the cowl, already doing the work. His reasons were implied, not stated. His history was a shadow at the edge of the page. Readers who picked up that first issue met a silhouette, not a man. A figure who operated by night, scared criminals and solved cases, who was clearly driven by something, but had not yet been asked to explain himself. The explanation came 6 months later. Detective Comics issue 33, November 1939. 2 pages, just 2, in which the writer Bill Finger laid out the whole of it. Young Bruce Wayne, walking home from the cinema with his parents, the mugger, the gun, the moment that split a life in, and the panel that would be reproduced, referenced, reimagined, and returned to for the next 80 years. A boy on his knees, fists clenched, making a vow over the bodies of the 2 people he loved most. It is worth pausing on Bill Finger for a moment, not because this story is about him. It is not primarily, but because there is something in his story that echoes forward into the lives we are following tonight. Bill Finger wrote Batman, not in the sense of one story, one contribution, one idea thrown into a room. He wrote the character in the fullest sense. He devised the name, Bruce Wayne. He described the costume that replaced Bob Kane's original Red Wing sketch, the cowl, the scalloped cape, the grey suit, the gloves, the blank white eyes that hid the man inside. He wrote Batman's origin. He wrote the rules by which Gotham City operated. He created the tone, part detective fiction, part gothic nightmare, part moral fable, that defined the character for every generation that followed. And for 76 years, his name appeared on nothing. Bob Kane negotiated sole creator credit in 1939 and held it for the rest of his life. Bill Finger worked and wrote and shaped the most recognizable hero in American fiction and died in 1974 with no formal acknowledgement. His name did not appear in a DC Comics credit until 2015. His name did not appear on a Batman film until 2016. We will return to that particular injustice, the long erasure of the man who built the thing because it rhymes, as the night goes on, with another erasure. Another man who gave everything to Batman and spent decades being known to the world only through a voice, never a face, never a name most people. But that is ahead of us. For now, stay with the wound. In Westbury, New York, in the middle of the 1950s, a boy was born into an Irish Catholic family that had recently moved, or was about to move, to Westport, Connecticut. He was the youngest of 4 children. His name was Kevin Conroy, though the world would not know that name for a long time. The household he grew up in was not a peaceful one. His father drank. The drinking was not a quiet thing, not the kind of sadness that folds inward and leaves the house undisturbed. It was the kind that left marks. Kevin Conroy would say, later in his life, that he had a complicated relationship. That word, complicated, does a great deal of work in a sentence. It carries the weight of things a person is not quite ready to say plainly. What is known, from what he chose to share, is this. His father once attempted suicide while Conroy was still in high school, and there was a specific night, that lodged itself in the boy's memory and did not leave when he saw his father drunk and bleeding on the floor. He also had a brother with schizophrenia. These are not details a person volunteers easily. Conroy held them privately for most of his adult life and shared them only in the final year of his life in a short comic he wrote for a DC Comics anthology. He shared them because he had finally found the right frame for them, the frame of Batman, of Crime Alley, of a boy who saw violence in his own home and carried it silently for 30 years until it erupted from him as a voice. We will get to that eruption. But for now, stay with the boy in Westport, Connecticut. He went to strict Catholic schools, as he described them. He was, by his own account, an outcast in middle school, one of those children for whom the social architecture of adolescence simply does not fit, who sits slightly outside the circle of belonging and watches from a distance that feels immeasurable. He was gay, though he did not have language for that yet, or if he did, the language available to a Catholic boy in 1960s Connecticut was not language that helped. It was language that condemned. The church around him, the family around him, the culture around him, none of it had a place for what he was. And so he learned, early, to put one face on the world while keeping another hidden inside. What he found, in the middle of all of that, was acting. It is not a surprise, in retrospect, that a boy who was learning to perform a version of himself for the world would be drawn to a discipline in which performing was the point, in which the mask was acknowledged, required, even celebrated. Acting gave Kevin Conroy a legitimate reason to be someone other than who he was required to be. It gave him permission, inside its contained and sanctioned space, to feel things he was not permitted to feel elsewhere. He was good at it, remarkably good quickly. He excelled in his high school's drama program with the kind of ability that makes teachers stop mid-sentence pay attention. He graduated early, and at 17 years old, in 1973, he was offered a full scholarship to the Juilliard School's drama division in New York City. There is a symmetry in the Juilliard years that feels almost too deliberate to be accidental. The kind of symmetry that makes you suspect the universe occasionally has a sense of composition. Kevin Conroy arrived at Juilliard in 1973. So did 2 other young actors. One was Christopher Reeve, a tall, quietly determined young man from Cornell University, already possessed of the kind of physical presence that made rooms rearrange themselves around him. The other was Robin Williams, chaotic, brilliant, spilling out of him at a speed that defied transcription, described by Reeve in his memoir as resembling an untied balloon that had been inflated and immediately. Reeve and Williams were assigned to the same dormitory room as freshmen and quickly became what Reeve called, in his own writing, something close to brothers. Conroy knew Reeve. They discussed sharing an apartment at some point, the details of which Conroy recounted in a social media post many years later, with the dry amusement of a man who had long since made peace with the randomness of his life. He could not afford the Soho rent, so he ended up rooming instead with Robin Williams. in an apartment where, Conroy recalled, they divided the space with half walls to save money and had, as he put it, not a lot of privacy. Christopher Reeve, studying across the hall or down the street, would go on to play Superman. Kevin Conroy, sharing a divided apartment with Robin Williams, would go on to play Batman. Both taught by the same man, the actor and director John Houseman, whose pedagogy was precise, rigorous, and rooted in the kind of classical discipline that takes an instinctive performer and gives the instinct a framework that will last a career. That two young men who would become the defining voices of the two greatest DC superheroes trained in the same building, under the same teeth, in the same years. That is either a remarkable coincidence or evidence that John Houseman was operating at a frequency the rest of us cannot hear. Now hold both childhoods together, because this is what Style 18 insists upon. Not one after the other, but side by side, on the same table, under the same light. Bruce Wayne in the fictional city of Gotham. A boy of approximately 8 or 9 years old, depending on which telling you trust. Leaving the cinema with his parents on a cool evening, walking down a street that would later be given the name Crime Alley by the people who had to explain it. A moment of ordinary life. A family. A night out, the small contentment of being together in the dark. And then the man with the gun, and the pearls scattering on the cobblestones, and the silence after 2 shots that would echo through every story ever told about him. Kevin Conroy in Westport, Connecticut. A boy growing up in a house where the air was always slightly pressurized, where the evenings sometimes changed without warning, where a father's illness could transform a room in the time it took to walk from the front door to the... A boy who had already learned, before he had words for it, that the self he carried inside did not match the self the world expected him to present. A boy who found, in acting, the only space in which this double existence was not a liability but a skill. Both of them wounded, both of them watching something happen to their families that they could not stop and could not explain. Both of them, in different ways and different worlds, making a kind of promise in that wound. Not spoken aloud, not formalized, but real. The promise that whatever they became, they would become it fully. They would not waste what the pain had given them. Bruce Wayne's promise was literal. A vow over 2 bodies on both knees in a dark alley to wage a war on crime that he would never be allowed to win and never be allowed to stop fighting. Kevin Conroy's promise was quieter. It was the promise of a child who walks into a drama class and feels, for the first time, that the ground is solid, that here, in this room, with these words there is something true, and he would give his life to it. Bill Finger wrote The Origin of Batman in 2 pages in November of 1939 because readers had begun to ask why. Why did this man dress as a bat and fight criminals in the dark? What was the engine of it? What made it necessary in a way that could not be satisfied by money or power or any of the ordinary consolation? The answer Finger gave was the simplest and most devastating answer available to human storytelling, because something was taken, because a boy watched his parents die and decided that the world that allowed that to happen was a world that needed to be answered for. Kevin Conroy read that origin, or something like it, for the first time as an adult in 1991, when he walked into an audition for an animated television series he knew almost nothing about. He had a vague memory of a campy 1960s television show. He had no particular attachment to the character. He walked into that room as a classically trained stage actor who paid his bills with soap opera appearances and television guest spots. He walked out of that room as Batman. But that story belongs to a later chapter. For now, this is enough. 2 childhoods, 2 wounds, 2 promises made in the dark. 1 fictional, 1 real. 1 published in a 10-cent comic book in November of 1939, and 1 carried silently through the streets of Westport, Connecticut, all the way to a Juilliard dormitory divided by half wall, all the way to a career on the stage, all the way to a recording booth in Los Angeles in the early 1990s, They were always going to find each other. The only question was when. Every person who has ever worn a mask understands something that people who have never worn one do not. The mask is not concealment, not at its deepest level. Concealment implies that what is hidden is shameful, that the face beneath deserves to be covered, that the world is right to demand its absence. The mask, properly understood, is something more precise than that. The mask is a decision, a deliberate and often painful choice to present one version of the self to a world that cannot be trusted with the other version, not because the hidden self is lesser, because the world has not yet earned it. Bruce Wayne understood this at a level that most people only approach in theory. The Batman the world knew in the 1940s and 1950s was, by later standards, a relatively straightforward figure. Dark, yes. Driven, certainly. But the full psychological complexity of what Bruce Wayne was actually doing, full weight of the decision to perform the billionaire playboy in daylight so that the creature in the cowl could operate freely by night, did not become the center of the character's story until later decades. It was the writers and artists of the 1970s, Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams, primarily pulled the psychological thread all the way through. They gave Batman his modern personality, the obsessive, driven, almost monastic figure who had sacrificed not just his comfort but his humanity on the altar of the vow. They made Bruce Wayne the act and Batman the actuality. The charming socialite at the charity dinner, the man photographed with models and politicians, the one who laughed at the right moments and said the right nothing, was the performance. The creature who dropped from a gargoyle into an alley at 3 in the morning was the truth. This inversion, the public face as fiction, the hidden self as reality, became, by the time Batman, the animated series arrived in 1992, the foundational premise of the character. The creative team of Bruce Timm and Paul Dini built their entire production around it. Their Batman was not a hero who happened to have a secret identity. He was a man whose secret identity was, paradoxically, the one without a secret. Bruce Wayne hid nothing about himself except that he was Batman. Batman hid nothing about himself except that he was Bruce Wayne. The mask was the truth. The face was the performance. In the writer's room and the production offices, this was sometimes described in shorthand as the Hamlet problem. Bruce Wayne, in this conception, was a man tortured by the ghost of his murdered father into a split existence consumed every waking hour. Not a hero who had found his cause, a wound that had learned to walk. In Westport, Connecticut, and then in New York City, and then in Los Angeles, Kevin Conroy was building a mask of his own. The construction began early. The materials were supplied by the world around him. The strict Catholic schools, the Irish Catholic household, the culture of the 1960s and 70s, which had made certain things clear about what was acceptable and what was not. Homosexuality was not acceptable. It was, in the environments Kevin Conroy inhabited as a boy and a young man, not merely socially disapproved of, but theologically condemned. The church said so from the pulpit. The family said so without saying so, in the particular silence that surrounds subjects that are understood to be unspeakable. The culture said so in 100 different registers, from the ridicule directed at gay men in the streets to the language used about them on television, in offices, in locker rooms. Conroy watched all of this. He absorbed the rules of the world he lived in with the precision of a person who understands that the rules, however unjust, are the operating conditions of survival. And he built the mask that the rules required. What the mask looked like from the outside was a serious and gifted young actor working his way through the standard architecture of an American theatrical career. The Juilliard training, the touring company, the Shakespeare Festival, the Broadway productions, the soap operas, the television guest spots, the long stretches of mid-level professional life that most actors inhabit, good enough to keep working, not yet elevated enough to be free of financial anxiety. He was charming when charm was required. He was professional when professionalism was called for. He had a voice, that remarkable, trained, classical instrument that made directors and casting agents and producers pay attention in the particular way they pay attention when something is genuinely different from the ordinary. Beneath the mask, 3 decades of grief and concealment that he would not describe publicly until the final year of his. What Kevin Conroy knew and carried alone for those 3 decades was the experience of living inside a double identity that was not a choice in the way that Bruce Wayne's double identity was a choice. Bruce Wayne chose the mask. He designed it, refined it, wore it deliberately, and could, in theory, however unimaginably, have removed it. Kevin Conroy's mask was imposed. It was the mask the world demanded of a gay man in a Catholic family in a country that had not yet decided whether people like him deserved to exist freely. He wore it. He wore it through Juilliard and through the acting company and through the Old Globe Theatre in San Diego, where he performed in Hamlet and A Midsummer Night's Dream for audiences who knew nothing about the man behind the roles. He wore it through the New York Shakespeare Festival in 1984, when he played the title role in Hamlet, a man famously caught between action and paralysis, between the self the world expects and the self that knows the truth, and received, by all accounts, reviews that confirmed what his teachers had already seen. He wore it through the 1980s, when the mask became almost unbearable to me. In the early 1980s, something happened to the community that Kevin Conroy had found, quietly, carefully, at the edges of his professional life, in the spaces the mask did not quite cover. A disease appeared. At first it had no name, then it had several names, none of them right. Then it had a name, AIDS, and the name carried with it a set of associations that the world mobilized with remarkable speed, associations of contamination, of divine punishment, of a population that the mainstream had already decided was expendable. Kevin Conroy went to funerals. This is the plain fact of it, stated plainly, because the plain statement is the most honest one. He went to funerals. He went to many funerals. Friends, colleagues, people he had known in the theatre, people he had known in private. The world he had carefully and quietly inhabited, the world beneath the mask, was dying. And the world above the mask, the public world, the world of network television and Broadway producers and daytime Emmy Awards and casting directors, was responding to that dying with silence, with avoidance, and in some cases with active hostility. He lost roles during this period. The mechanism was the familiar one, a whisper, a suspicion, a rumor that reached the right ears at the wrong moment. He never spoke about these losses in specific terms. He was not a man who named names or settled scores, but in the autobiographical he published in June of 2022, he acknowledged them plainly. People in his industry called him slurs. People in his own family called him slurs. He watched a generation die around him and worked through it, because the alternative was not to work, and the work was the only space in which the full self, all of it, the grief and the talent and the fury and the love, was permitted to exist. In 1988, he appeared in a play called Eastern Standard, which ran on Broadway. In the play, he portrayed a television producer secretly battling AIDS. He would describe the experience in a New York Times interview nearly 30 years later, with a precision that made clear the performance had cost him something real. He said, "I went to so many funerals that I felt such a sense of obligation to do it right. Every night I would just wail, feeling all the pain. I couldn't not feel it. It was a scream of, look what's happening to help." That line, that scream dressed as performance, that grief wearing the mask of art, is one of the most precise descriptions Kevin Conroy ever gave of what acting meant to him. And it is, in another register, a description of what Batman was always doing, channeling the unspeakable into something that could be seen and heard and felt from a safe distance, making the private wound into a public act of protection. Batman, in the DC animated universe, the version Kevin Conroy would eventually give his voice to, had a specific relationship with the mask that the show's creators were deliberate about from the beginning. Paul Dini, who was the principal writer and one of the show's producers, and Bruce Timm, who designed the visual world of the series and produced it, were both students of Batman's mythology in the deep sense. They understood the character not as a superhero who happened to have a dual identity, a genre convention, a practical necessity, but as a man for whom the duality was the whole of the story. Bruce Wayne was not Batman with the mask off. Batman was Bruce Wayne with the mask off. The cowl, the cape, the altered voice, the deliberate theatricality of the Dark Knight persona, all of it was the truth. The silk tie, and the champagne glass, and the bored socialite smile at the charity gala, all of it was the performance. The animated series rendered this visually through a set of Bruce Wayne moved differently from Batman, lighter, more casual, slightly unfocused, as though his attention were always elsewhere. He laughed at parties in a way that never quite reached his eyes. He maintained the social obligations of extreme wealth with the patient efficiency of someone fulfilling a contractual requirement. There was no joy in it. There was barely even presence. The thing that Bruce Wayne was, the full, driven, grieving, purposeful thing, existed only in the other register, and the series made certain that the viewer felt the difference. Conroy rendered this difference through sound. His Bruce Wayne voice was lighter, higher in register, slightly more amused, a voice that moved through rooms without weight, that made small talk without investment, that projected exactly the correct amount of charm without ever projecting anything that might be mistaken for truth. His Batman voice was lower, controlled, each word placed with the deliberateness of someone who has decided that every syllable must carry its full meaning or not be spoken at all. The difference between the two voices was not the difference between two characters. It was the difference between a man performing and a man existing. He had a model for this, not from comic books. He had not read them, but from a 1934 film he had encountered in his theatrical training. The Scarlet Pimpernel, starring Leslie Howard, in which an English aristocrat of the late 18th century maintains a public persona of foppish uselessness while operating in secret as the most effective agent rescuing French aristocrats from the guillotine. The foppishness is the disguise. The competence is the truth. Two voices, two registers, two completely different ways of occupying a room. And the audience, who knows both, watches with the particular pleasure of being trusted. Conroy heard his life in that structure. He was the only voice actor in the history of Batman animation to use two genuinely distinct voices for the character. The first time it had been done in animation, though Michael Keaton had approached something similar in Tim Burton's live-action films of 1989 and 1992. The producers, hearing Conroy's initial audition recordings, recognized immediately that this was correct. Not technically interesting, but narratively essential. Batman without the distinction between the two voices was Batman without the central premise. A man who sounded the same in the boardroom and in the alley had not understood what the costume was. The producers had one note. In the early recordings, Conroy's Bruce Wayne voice was perhaps a touch too arch, too manifestly different from the Batman voice. The gap between them wide enough that listeners might be pulled out of the fiction to admire the technique. They asked him to close the gap slightly, to make Bruce Wayne's performed lightness subtler, more embedded, less obviously theatrical. He went back and re-recorded several of the early episodes. The adjustment was, and what emerged was a performance so integrated, so internally consistent, that a generation of listeners would grow up hearing that voice as simply the truth, not a performance, not a craft decision, but the actual sound of a man who had been doing this for 20 years and was very, very tired and very, very certain and was not going to stop. There is one more thing to say about masks, and it belongs to both men equally. A mask works only if the person wearing it believes in the necessity of concealment, if they have accepted, at some level, that the self beneath is safer hidden, that the world outside is not yet ready to hold the truth of what they actually are. Bruce Wayne believed this because the evidence was overwhelming. Gotham City had killed his parents without consequence. Its police were compromised. Its institutions were bought. Its streets were owned by the kind of people who shot families in front of their children for a pearl necklace. The city needed Batman. It did not need to know that Batman was a traumatized billionaire in his 30s who had not slept a full night in 20 years and spoke in a different voice to his butler than he did to his enemies. The mask was not vanity. It was operational necessity. Kevin Conroy believed it because the evidence was equally overwhelming. His industry had cost him roles for being gay. His culture had let his friends die without intervention. His church had told him that what he was constituted a failure of the soul. His brother, in a moment of anger that Conroy would recall specific decades later, had used a slur that contained the whole of what the world thought about men like. The mask was not vanity, it was survival. What neither man fully anticipated was what the mask would cost. Bruce Wayne would discover this in a rainstorm, kneeling at his parents' graves, begging them to release him from a promise that was consuming everything. Every possibility of love, every chance of rest, every ordinary human moment that other people took for granted, and he had traded away without fully understanding the exchange rate. Kevin Conroy would discover it in a recording booth in Los Angeles in 1993, reading those exact lines into a microphone, drawing on something that was not fictional. But that is a later chapter. For now, two men behind their masks, one in a cave beneath a mansion, speaking in a voice that no one outside the cave was permitted to hear. One in the dressing rooms and rehearsal halls and television green rooms of a long career, speaking in a voice that was perfectly calibrated to tell the world exactly what it needed to hear. Both waiting, without quite knowing it, for the moment when the mask and the face would finally tell the same story. Before a thing becomes what it is meant to be, it spends a long time being something else. This is not failure. It is not wasted time, not wrong turns, not the embarrassing early work that a successful person learns to deprecate gracefully in interviews. It is the only process available. The sculptor cannot begin with the finished form. The finished form is what the work is moving toward, and the work takes as long as it takes, and the material resists in ways that cannot be anticipated until the chisel is already moving. Bruce Wayne spent roughly 2 decades becoming Batman before the comics understood what Batman was supposed to be. Kevin Conroy spent roughly 2 decades becoming the voice of Batman before anyone thought to ask him to audition. Neither of them was idle in those years. Both of them were doing exactly what the work required. Batman's apprenticeship, the character's own long becoming, is a stranger story than most people. He arrived in 1939 as something genuinely dark. The earliest issues of Detective Comics presented a Batman who operated without mercy, who dropped criminals from great heights, who on at least one occasion strung a man up by his neck. Bill Finger's writing and Bob Kane's art produced, in those first months, a figure of genuine menace, not the reassuring protector of later decades, but a creature the criminals of Gotham had reason to fear in the most immediate physical sense. He used guns. He was not above killing. He moved through the stories with the cold efficiency of someone who had decided that Gotham's criminals had forfeited their right to be treated as human beings deserving of restraint. This version of Batman did not last long, because it could not. The audience for the comics was, in large part, children. And a Batman who killed without hesitation was a Batman who could not be a hero in the sense that children needed heroes to be, which is, to say, a figure who operated by a code, who won, because the code was better than the alternative, who demonstrated through his choices that there was a way to fight darkness without becoming it. Within a year or two of his debut, Batman had been softened, not entirely, but meaningfully. The guns disappeared. The deaths became less frequent and then, eventually, non-existent. A moral code emerged that would become, over the following 8 decades, the most defining and most contested element of the character. Batman does not kill. This rule would be debated, tested, and dramatized in virtually every major Batman story ever told. It would be the source of his greatness and the source of his most devastating failures. It would be the thing that set him apart from the criminals he pursued, and the thing that, in certain stories, seemed to make him complicit in the violence that followed from his restraint. But it was the rule, and it became, in time, inseparable from the character. The 1940s and 1950s gave Batman something else: a partner. Robin arrived in Detective Comics issue 38 in April of 1940, a young acrobat named Dick Grayson, whose origin deliberately paralleled Batman's own. His parents murdered while performing their trapeze act, leaving the boy without family and without future in a single evening. Bill Finger and Bob Kane brought Robin into the story for a reason that Finger described quite plainly. Batman needed someone to talk to. A detective who thought entirely in internal monologue was a difficult character to write, and more important, a difficult character to care about. Robin gave Batman a human relationship, unequal, protective, occasionally manipulative in ways that later writers would examine with uncomfortable honesty, but real. A bond, a reason to come back from the alley. Then came the 1960s, and the wheel turned in a direction nobody had quite intended. The television series of 1966, starring Adam West as Batman and Burt Ward as Robin, broadcasting on ABC in vivid, campy, brightly colored episodes that treated the source material as an extended comedy sketch, was enormously popular. It was also, for the character's long-term mythology, something close to a disaster. The series committed to a register of ironic self-awareness and theatrical absurdity that was genuinely funny on its own terms, but entirely incompatible with the dark, driven, grief-fueled figure that Finger and Kane had originally. Batman threw puns. Batman square-danced. Batman encountered villains, whose primary mode of villainy was elaborate wordplay. The show aired twice a week during its peak and reached audiences of 30 million people, and those 30 million people absorbed an image of Batman that would take 2 decades to fully displace. By the early 1970s, the comics were in serious trouble. The Batman of the Adam West era had infected the printed page, and readers were drifting away. The character felt irrelevant, a campy relic of a more innocent cultural moment, poorly equipped for an era that had seen assassinations and a lost war, and the first serious reckoning with the corruption embedded in American institutions. Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams changed that. O'Neil as writer, Adams as artist, 2 craftsmen working in concert, the way the best comics partnerships always work, each pushing the other towards something neither could quite reach alone. They returned Batman to the darkness. They stripped away the camp, the comedy, the sense that Gotham City was a playground where nothing truly terrible happened. They gave the character his modern psychological complexity, the obsession, the rigor, the absolute refusal to be anything other than what the vow required. They sent him around the world. They gave him Ra's al Ghul, a villain who matched him not in power but in conviction, a man who had also decided to wage a one-person war on the corruption of the world and had chosen a rather different set of methods. They made Batman serious again, in the fullest sense of that word. Then Frank Miller arrived in 1986 with The Dark Knight Returns. Miller's Batman was old, retired, living in Wayne Manor as a ghost of himself, 55 years old, his body carrying the accumulated damage of decades of a career that the human body was not designed to sustain. He had not been Batman for 10 years when the story began. Gotham had gotten worse without him, in the way that Gotham always gets worse, steadily, methodically, with the cheerful indifference of a city that understands that its protector will not be around forever and has made its arrangements accordingly. The Batman who returned from that retirement was not the Batman of the 1970s. He was something harder, more desperate, more frightening. A man who had returned not because he believed he could win, but because the alternative to trying was living inside the knowledge that he had stopped. Miller's Batman bled. He suffered. He made choices that the earlier, cleaner version of the character would never have been permitted to make. He confronted Superman. He won, more or less. and it cost him everything, and at the end he was still standing, which in Miller's conception was itself a kind of victory. The Dark Knight Returns sold in numbers that the comics industry had not seen in years. It brought adults back to Batman in significant numbers. It established the template, the aged, battered, morally compromised, absolutely committed Dark Knight that would inform Batman's storytelling for the following 4 decades. And it arrived at exactly the right moment, because the animated series that would define the character for an entire generation was less than a decade away, and the people who would make that series read Miller's work and understood immediately what register they were operating in. Kevin Conroy's Apprenticeship had fewer dramatic turning points and considerably more quiet persistence. After Juilliard, after the acting company, after the national tour of Death Trap that took him across American cities in the mid to late 1970s, he settled into the life of a working New York theater actor. It was not a glamorous life. It was, in the way of most serious theatrical careers at the beginning, a life conducted at close range with financial anxiety, punctuated by stretches of unemployment that actors learned to describe as periods of audition rather than periods of failure. He became associated with the Old Globe Theatre in San Diego, one of the country's finest regional theatres, housed in Balboa Park, with a tradition of classical productions that attracted serious actors and serious audiences. He performed in Hamlet there. He performed in A Midsummer Night's Dream. He was, by every account available, very good. The kind of actor that other actors notice, whose work has a quality of genuine inhabitation rather than technical surface. In 1984, he played Hamlet, not in a regional production, not in a workshop or a festival sidebar, but as the lead production of the New York Shakespeare Festival, one of the most prestigious classical theater institutions in the United States, founded by Joseph Papp, located in Central Park. The kind of engagement that marks an actor as someone the serious theatrical world has decided to take seriously. He was 28 years old. He played the Prince of Denmark, the role that is, in English language theatre, the supreme test of a classical actor's range, the role that requires simultaneous access to grief and wit, to action and paralysis, to love and contempt, and the particular despair of a person who understands everything about their situation and cannot make themselves move. It is worth sitting with this for a moment. Kevin Conroy, in 1984, played Hamlet. Kevin Conroy, 8 years later, would be cast as the voice of a character whose writers described as Hamlet, a man tortured by the ghost of his murdered father into a split personality that consumed his int. The connection is not coincidental. It is not a biographical footnote. It is the entire story, viewed from a slight distance. Hamlet puts on a mask. He adopts an antic disposition, a performance of madness, to move through a court that has been corrupted by his father's murder, to investigate without being investigated, to get close to the truth while appearing to be someone from whom the truth has nothing to fear. The mask is the method. The real Hamlet, grieving, certain, furious, in love, exhausted by the distance between what he knows and what he can prove, operates beneath it. Conroy played that character at 28 in Central Park in the summer of 1984. He brought to it everything he had, the Juilliard training, the years of work, and, though it was not yet a thing he could name or speak about publicly, the private experience of a man who had been wearing a mask of his own since childhood, who understood from the inside what it cost. The late 1980s were complicated years in ways that intersected with the public and the private in equal measure. Professionally, Conroy made the transition that most serious stage actors negotiate with themselves, toward television, toward the income that the stage cannot reliably provide, toward the wider audience and the steadier work that the medium offered. He appeared in Dynasty, the glossy, operatic prime-time soap opera that was, in its moment, one of the most watched programs in America. He had recurring roles on Tour of Duty, a drama about the Vietnam War that ran from 1987 to 1988. He appeared on O'Hara. He did guest spots on Cheers, Murphy Brown, Matlock, Spencer. For hire, the standard circuit of a working television actor in that era, the steady accumulation of credit that does not constitute a career breakthrough, but constitutes a career. He was also, in those same years, working on his voice in ways he was not fully conscious of. This is not a mystical claim. It is a practical one, and it is the kind of thing that happens to serious actors who work across different registers and mediums over a long period of time. The stage demands projection, stamina, the ability to sustain a performance 2 hours through continuous embodiment without the safety net of a second take. The soap opera demands a different kind of truth, the compressed, close-range, camera-aware truth of intimate drama, where the face cannot hide anything, and every micro-movement of the eyes is visible to 15 million people sitting 3 feet from their television screens. The television drama demands something different again. The commercial voiceover work that Conroy had been doing on the side, the anonymous voice selling products, this disembodied authority of narration, demanded something else entirely. The discovery of what a voice could do when the body was removed from the equation. Most actors who cross between these mediums unconsciously develop a set of registers, a vocabulary of vocal and physical choices that expands with each new form. Conroy, by 1991, had been accumulating that vocabulary for the better part of 2 decades. He was 35 years old. He had Juilliard, he had Shakespeare. He had 2 hours of Hamlet in Central Park, and 6 months of Dynasty, and 3 seasons of Tour of Duty, and more guest appearances than he could probably enumerate. He had, though he had not yet been asked to deploy it in this specific way, an instrument. He had a friend in the casting world who knew this. The friend mentioned his name to someone who mentioned it to someone else. The chain of recommendation that leads to any audition is usually too casual and too accidental to be reconstructed with confidence, but the broad shape of it is clear enough. Someone who knew Conroy's voice told someone who was looking for a voice, and Conroy's agent passed along the information, and one morning Conroy arrived for a cold audition for a Warner Brothers animated series he had been told almost nothing about. He knew the character had been played on television in the 1960s by Adam West. He had been told in so many words to discard those impressions. He did not know, walking into that room, that the instrument he had spent 20 years building was the precise instrument the room required. The comics, by the late 1980s, had arrived at something, not a conclusion. Batman stories do not have conclusion because Batman is not a story with an ending built into its structure, but a clarity. Frank Miller had shown what the character looked like at the absolute limit of his endurance. Alan Moore had shown, in The Killing Joke, in 1988, what the character looked like when the thing he had been defending, the bright line between the world that hurt people and the world that protected them, came close to breaking. Grant Morrison and Dave McKean had shown, in Arkham Asylum that same year, what the character looked like when the architecture of his psychological certainty was subjected to real pressure. The character had earned his darkness. In other words, the comics had done the work, and then Tim Burton arrived in 1989 with a film that made $251 million worldwide and introduced Batman to an audience that had never read a comic in their life, an audience that was significantly adult. That found the character not campy or childish, but genuinely menacing and genuinely affecting. That walked out of cinemas thinking about what they had just seen. Warner Bros., watching those box office numbers, understood that they had something, not just a franchise, a mythology, a character who could carry the full weight of adult storytelling, grief and obsession, and moral complexity, and the particular loneliness of someone who has chosen a vocation that the world cannot share and still fill a cinema on a Friday evening. They commissioned an animated series. The brief they gave their creative team was, in essence, this: take the darkness seriously. The show would not be a children's cartoon in the dismissive sense. It would be a noir It would be a detective story. It would take place in a city that had the architecture of 1940s New York and the moral atmosphere of a Fritz Lang film. The villains would have psychology, the stories would have consequences, and Batman, the character at the center of it all, would be a man that an adult could respect and grieve, not a costumed figure that a child could cheer at from a safe distance. Bruce Timm designed that world. He drew its buildings and its shadows and its people on black paper rather than white, which is why the series looks the way it does. Darker, heavier, the shadows native to the image rather than added on top. He called the aesthetic Dark Deco, and the name was precise. The 1940s Art Deco architecture, the skyscrapers with their setbacks and their ornamental detail, married to the moral darkness of film. Noir, a city that was beautiful and corrupted simultaneously, in the way that the best cities always are. Paul Dini wrote into that world stories of remarkable emotional sophistication. His episode, Heart of Ice, which redefined the villain, Mr. Freeze, as a tragic figure rather than a campy one. A scientist whose wife was dying of a rare disease, who had devoted his life to saving her and lost everything else in the process, won a Daytime Emmy for outstanding writing in an animated program. It was the first time an animated series of this kind had won that award for a reason that went beyond technical excellence. And into this world, in 1991, casting director Andrea Romano went looking for a voice. She listened to hundreds of auditions. She was looking for something specific, though she could not have described it in advance, which is the condition under which the best casting decisions are always made. The recognition of the right thing when it arrives, rather than the specific in advance. Kevin Conroy walked into the room with 2 decades of work and 35 years of living, and the producers asked him a question. The character's nickname is the Dark Knight. Use your imagination. What sound do you think a Dark Knight would make? In the Batman comics, there is a period that readers and scholars sometimes call the wilderness years, the 1960s and early 70s, when the character had drifted from his origins and was performing a version of himself that served the moment, but not the mythology. Batman in a bright blue costume, Batman cracking jokes, Batman in stories that resolved in 20 pages without consequence or cost. The essential Bruce Wayne, the wounded child who had turned his wound into a weapon, was still in there, somewhere, underneath the camp and the color. But he was not visible. The mask the character wore in those years was not the cowl of the Dark Knight. It was the broad grin of a man performing safety for an audience that did not yet trust him with anything else. Kevin Conroy's wilderness years, if that is the right term for a period during which he was working, building an instrument of considerable power, were the years between Juilliard and the audition room, the dynasty years, the tour of duty years, the soap opera years, the guest spot years, the years of being very good at things that did not quite fit the particular shape of what he was, of deploying a remarkable instrument in context that could not fully hear it. Both of them were waiting, in those years, for the question that would unlock the thing that had been building. For Bruce Wayne, for the character, across the long arc of the comics, the question was always the same one, underneath every variation. Can you keep the promise? Can you be Batman, fully and finally, and without reservation, regardless of what it costs? The character's answer, delivered across 8 decades of stories with varying degrees of eloquence and suffering, was always yes. For Kevin Conroy, the question arrived on a specific afternoon, in a specific room, phrased in a specific way that would not have worked if it had been phrased differently. Not what does Batman sound like? That was the wrong question, because he did not know what Batman sounded like, and the wrong kind of actor would have guessed, and the guess would have been wrong. But what does a Dark Knight sound like? That was the right question, because it bypassed the character entirely and went directly to the archetype. And Kevin Conroy, who had spent 2 decades training himself to access archetype, knew exactly what to do. He opened his mouth. Something came out. He did not recognize it as his own voice. But we are still a chapter away from that moment, and it deserves its own space. For now, the apprenticeship is complete. Two figures, in two worlds, have done the long and unglamorous work of becoming what they need to be. The comics have found their darkness. The actor has found his instrument. The city of Gotham is waiting, black paper and all, for someone to give it a voice. The audition room is ready. There are moments in a life that do not feel, while they are happening, like the thing they turn out to be. The morning of the audition does not arrive with ceremony. There is no particular quality to the light, no atmospheric signal that today is different from yesterday, no internal sensation that might alert the person moving through it that they are about to walk through a door that will not open again from the other side. They eat breakfast or do not. They take the route they usually take. They arrive at the building and go inside and wait in whatever manner they wait. Some people sit still. Some people run lines. Some people retreat entirely into a practiced blankness that insulates them from the specific anxiety of professional evaluation. And then they are called in, and the moment begins. Kevin Conroy arrived at the audition for Batman, the animated series, in 1991 on a friend's recommendation. His agent had passed along the information. He had been told it was a Warner Brothers animated series, based on the DC Comics character Batman. He knew the character from the 1960s television show. Adam West in the bright blue costume, the PW and wham of the fight scenes, the camp register that was its own kind of art form, but bore no relationship to what the room he was walking into was trying to create. He had been advised to set those impressions aside. He was not a comic book reader. He had not grown up with the mythology. He arrived, in other words, without the specific cultural baggage that a lifelong Batman fan would have brought. The accumulated weight of preferred interpretations, beloved storylines, strong opinions about which decade of the comics had gotten the character most right. He arrived clean, as a classically trained stage actor who had spent 20 years building an instrument and had not yet been asked to play this particular note. The audition room contained the producers and Bruce Timm, and, crucially, Andrea Romano, the casting and voice director who had been conducting this search for months, who had listened to hundreds of voices and had not yet heard the one she was looking for in the specific way that told her the search was over. Romano was, by all accounts, one of the finest casting directors working in animation, a person whose ear for the right voice was matched by her understanding of what a voice actor needed to be given in order to produce their best work. She trusted the performers she worked with. She created the conditions under which the performance she needed could actually occur. She gave Kevin Conroy a direction, not a technical note, not a vocal instruction, not an industry standard prompt about pitch or pace or projection. She gave him an imaginative frame and trusted him to inhabit it. The character's nickname is the Dark Knight. Use your imagination. What sound do you think a Dark Knight would make? This was the correct question. It would not have worked as a different question. Sound like Batman would have produced an impression. A competent actor's reasonable approximation of a character, shaped by whatever cultural templates were available. Sound like a Dark Knight produced something else. It produced an access point into archetype, into the territory that a Juilliard, trained classical actor who had spent years working with Shakespeare's kings and generals and princes, navigated instinctively. Conroy did not think about it in analytical terms. The question landed somewhere below analysis. His voice dropped. It did not drop in the way that a person consciously lowers their voice. A mechanical adjustment, a choice made above the level of the body. It dropped from somewhere deep. A register opened that he had not, in the ordinary course of his professional life, been asked to open. Husky, dark, controlled in the specific way that controlled things contain enormous pressure, not because the pressure has been eliminated, but because the container is strong enough to hold it. The producers looked at it. That's exactly what we want. Andrea Romano cast him immediately. Not after deliberation, not after comparing him to a shortlist, not after the standard industry ritual of calling back multiple candidates for a second round. The search that had been going on for months ended in the time it took Conroy to speak one sentence in a voice he had not known he possessed. What happened in the recording booth, in the weeks and months that followed the audition, was a process of discovery rather than a process of execution. Conroy was not implementing a plan he had formed in the audition room. He was continuing to explore a territory that had opened up, and finding as he moved through it that it was larger and more complex than the initial entry point had suggested. The two-voice decision emerged from this exploration. He had been thinking about the character, about the fundamental strangeness of the premise, which he described in various interviews over the years, with a consistent wryness that suggested he found it genuinely amusing, even as he took it completely seriously. Here was the wealthiest man in Gotham City, the most eligible bachelor, the most photographed, the most written about, the most socially prominent figure in a city that had no shortage of prominent figures. This man put on a mask and a cape and went out into the night, and no one recognized him. No one connected the billionaire to the vigilante. No one made the obvious inference. "Come on," was essentially Conroy's reaction as he described it to interviewers years later. There has to be more to the disguise. He found his model not in the comics, which he still had not read in any depth, but in a film he had encountered in his theatrical training. The Scarlet Pimpernel, 1934, starring Leslie Howard in the title role. The premise was structurally identical to Batman's, an English aristocrat of conspicuous wealth and social prominence, publicly performed as a fop, vain, tedious, preoccupied with fashion and gossip, and the trivial architecture of upper-class social life. Beneath that performance, operating with absolute precision and considerable physical courage, the most effective agent rescuing condemned prisoners from the French Revolutionary Terror. Two voices, two registers, two completely different ways of being present in a room. The fop's voice, light, slightly affected, bored with everything, moving through conversation with effortlessness of someone who has never had to think about whether they belong. The agent's voice, direct, economical, carrying the particular authority of a person who has decided that every word must earn its place or be replaced by silence. Howard played both with full commitment, which is the only way to play a double identity. The performance of vacuousness must be as complete as the performance of competence, because the entire architecture of the deception collapses the moment the audience can see the scene. Conroy heard this. He understood it in his body, not just his mind, because he had been doing a version of it himself. The charming professional, face above, the private reality below. For 3 decades, Bruce Wayne's voice in Conroy's rendering was lighter, a half step higher in pitch, more amused, more socially fluent, slightly unfocused at the edges. The voice of a person who was performing ease so convincingly that ease was what the world received. There was no tremor in it, no crack, no place where the other thing showed through. It was a complete performance. 2 full decades of classical acting in service of a voice that sounded like nothing in particular. Batman's voice was the opposite of nothing in particular. It was the sound of 3 decades of specific, accumulated, irreducible experience poured through an instrument that had been built precisely for this purpose. Lower, controlled. Each word placed with the deliberateness of someone who had decided that language, in this register, was not decoration but function, not the voice of a man performing authority, the voice of a man who was authority, not by virtue of his wealth or his position, but by virtue of the decision he had made in a dark alley 20 years ago, and had renewed every morning since. The producer's only note closed the gap slightly. The Bruce Wayne voice in those first recordings was perhaps too obviously performed, the wryness too marked, the lightness too emphatic, the gap between the two registers wide enough that a listener might step back from the story to admire the craft. Make Bruce Wayne subtler, they said. Let the charm be more embedded, less theatrical. Let the performance be so complete that no one notices. it is a performance. He went back and re-recorded several of the early episodes. The adjustment was made, and what emerged from the process, the audition, the exploration, the note, the re-recording, was a performance of such internal consistency that it would become, for millions of people across multiple generations, simply the truth of who the character was. Not a creative choice, not a voice actor's interpretation. The actual sound of Bruce Wayne and Batman, as though they had always sounded like this and always would. Batman, the animated series, premiered in September of 1990. The first episode to be produced, though not the first to air, due to the scheduling decisions that govern commercial television, was called On Leather Wings. It depicted Batman pursuing a bat-like creature across Gotham City, while the police, characteristically, suspected Batman himself. It introduced the world of the series, the black paper, the dark deco architecture, the orchestral score, influenced by Danny Elfman's work on the Burton films and driven forward by Shirley Walker, who would become the defining musical voice. The voice cast of extraordinary caliber that Romano had assembled across months of searching. It was, from its opening frame, something different. Not different in the way that marketing departments use the word, a rhetorical claim, a positioning statement. Different in the way that a thing is different when the people who made it refuse to accept a lower ceiling. The first shot of Gotham City at night, the police blimp crossing the skyline, the shadows falling with the weight of shadow rather than the approximated shadow of cheaper production, told the viewer immediately that this was a world that took itself seriously, that had decided, before a single story was told, that the story mattered. The episode that contained the moment Kevin Conroy identified as the crystallization of who his Batman was aired on the 15th of September, 1992. It was the 10th episode to be broadcast, though it was the third to be produced. The scheduling of early BTAS episodes followed a commercial logic rather than a creative one. The episode was called Nothing to Fear. Its villain was the Scarecrow, a former psychology professor named Jonathan Crane, who had been expelled from Gotham University for conducting fear experiments on his students, and who was now attacking the university with a toxin that caused his victims to experience vivid hallucinations of their deepest terrors. Batman encountered the toxin, and what Batman feared, what lived at the bottom of the well, beneath the training and the equipment and the iron certainty of the vow, was the voice of his father. Not the dead Thomas Wayne of Crime Alley, but a hallucinatory Thomas Wayne who stood over his kneeling son in the darkness and told him he was a disgrace, that he had shamed the family name, that the man who wore the cape was not the son that Thomas Wayne had hoped to raise. This was, in 1992, the most psychologically precise thing that had been done with the character in any medium outside of the most ambitious comics runs. The fear was not death, not pain, not failure in the physical sense. It was the possibility of being seen by the dead parent whose memory had been the engine of everything and found wanting. It was the possibility that the vow itself, the thing consumed the life, was not what the parent would have wanted, that the sacrifice had been made for a ghost who would have preferred a different kind of son. Batman overcame the fear. He rejected the hallucination. And in doing so, he spoke a line that would echo forward through every medium in which Kevin Conroy subsequently inhabited the character, in animation, in film, in video games, in convention halls, in a Ground Zero kitchen, in the credits of the final game released after his death. The line was spoken while Batman was dangling from a runaway airship over Gotham City, fighting off both the toxin and the Scarecrow's men. And it arrived not as a battle cry, but as a declaration of identity, a statement made primarily to the ghost of a father, only incidentally to the villains. You are not my father. I am not a disgrace. I am vengeance. I am the night. I am Batman. There is a great deal that could be said about that line, and most of it has been said in various registers by various people over the 30 years since it was first broadcast. It became a signature. It became a convention opener. It became a shorthand for a certain kind of committed, unironic, fully inhabited performance of heroism. Children who watched the series in the 1990s grew up and had children of their own, and the line remained. It spread into other media. It was referenced, parodied, honored, quoted. Mark Hamill's Joker in various animated productions occasionally deployed it as a taunt, evidence that even the character's greatest antagonist understood that the line was not rhetoric but identity. What is less often discussed is the specific context in which the line was written. Batman was not declaring his identity to the world. He was declaring it to his dead father. The "you are not my father" that precedes the famous three-beat structure is the part that carries the psychological weight. The hallucination had told him he was a disgrace. He had to tell the hallucination, had to tell whatever part of himself the hallucination represented, that it was wrong, that the man in the cape was not a disgrace but a fulfillment, that the vow made in Crime Alley was being honored, not betrayed. Kevin Conroy delivered that line with an intensity that came from somewhere, he would say, years later, in the phrasing he returned to consistently when asked about the deepest moments of the performance, that you could not fake Batman, that the voice required grounding in the actual pain of the character's childhood, not as an actor's technique, not as a method exercise, but as a simple requirement of truthfulness. A voice that was not rooted in real grief sounded like a voice that was trying to sound like grief, and the audience heard the difference, always. The grief Conroy rooted it in was not Bruce Wayne's grief. It was his own, his father, the alcoholic, the night he found him bloody on the floor. The years of not being able to name what he was, of performing a version of himself for a world that had made the requirements very clear. The friends who died in the 1980s, the roles he lost, the brother who called him a slur. 30 years of carrying things that had no legitimate container, no accepted place in the world as it had presented itself to him. Until one afternoon in 1991, he walked into a room and a woman asked him what sound a dark night would make. The voice that came out was made of all of it, not as metaphor, as material. The way a sculptor's hands history of everything they have touched, and that history is present in every surface they subsequently. The Batman voice was not Kevin Conroy performing pain. It was Kevin Conroy's pain, organized and disciplined and projected outward through the instrument he had spent 20 years building into a fictional world where it could do what it had always wanted to do, which was protect some. Batman, the animated series, ran for 85 episodes in its original form, concluding in September of 1995. Before its original run had ended, it had already changed the terms on which animated television was evaluated. It had won multiple Daytime Emmy Awards. It had produced, in Paul Dini's Heart of Ice, what many critics and fans regarded as the final episode of superhero animation ever made, a story about grief and love and obsession, the particular madness of a person who has decided that the world owes them a debt it cannot pay, told in 22 minutes without a single wasted frame. It had also produced something harder to measure but more durable. It had produced a generation of people for whom the voice of Batman was Kevin Conroy's voice, not as a preference or a nostalgic attachment, but as a deep perceptual fact. When those people read a Batman comic, any Batman comic, from any era, in any style, they heard a specific voice speaking the dialogue. When they watched a different actor play the role in a film or a television production, they were always, at some level, making a comparison. The comparison was not always conscious, but the standard was always there. DC.com, in the tribute published after Conroy's death, articulated this with unusual precision. If you can hear Kevin's voice when you read a Batman comic, that is a good Batman comic. The voice had become the measure of the character, not just one interpretation among many, but the benchmark against which all other interpretations were evaluated, including the source material itself. This is what it means to define a character, not to play it well, not to give a memorable performance, to define it, to give it a sound and a rhythm and an internal life so complete that the character cannot be fully imagined without that sound. Marlon Brando defined a certain kind of American masculinity. Alec Guinness defined a certain kind of English moral authority. Kevin Conroy defined Batman. He was 35 years old when he walked into the audition room. He was 66 years old when he died. Still the voice of the character, still the standard. In between, he voiced Batman in different productions, 15 animated films, 15 television series spanning nearly 400 episodes, and more than 100 hours of television, more than 24 video games. He was, by every available measure, the longest-running Batman actor in the history of the character, in any medium, live action or animated. The previous record had been held by Olan Soule, who voiced Batman in animated works from the late 1960s through the early 1980s, including the Super Friends series. Conroy surpassed that record sometime in the mid to late 1990s and continued extending it for another quarter of a century. He was also the only voice actor to appear in every production in the DC animated universe, every series, every film, every guest appearance, every crossover. The DCAL began with his voice and was sustained by it for the entirety of its run. In September of 1992, a television set somewhere, in a living room, in a bedroom, in the specific warm darkness of a child's evening, received a transmission from a fictional city drawn on black paper, inhabited by a character who had been waiting since 1939 for someone to give him the right voice. The voice arrived. From Westbury, New York, from Westport, Connecticut, from a strict Catholic school, and a complicated household, and a Juilliard dormitory divided by half walls, from the New York Shakespeare Festival and the Broadway stage, and the long journeyman years of soap operas and guest spots, from 30 years of carrying things that had no container, from an audition room where a woman asked the right question, and something came out that shook the body of the man speaking it. The character had found his voice. The man had found his character, and for the next 30 years, in a relationship more precisely matched than almost any other in the history of popular culture, they would be. There is a version of the night that most people know only from the outside. They know it as an absence, the withdrawal of daylight, the closing of the ordinary world, the hours in which the things that could not be said or done or acknowledged in the glare of the functioning day become, if not possible, at least conceivable. The night, from the outside, is where the difficult things happen, where the decisions are made that morning we'll have to live with, where the grief that has no legitimate daytime container finally finds the darkness wide enough to hold it. Batman knew the night from the inside. Kevin Conroy was learning it in the same years. The DC animated universe expanded in the way that good worlds expand, not by intention alone, but by the logic of its own internal. If the world is real enough, it generates more story. If the characters are sufficiently alive, they demand further investigation. Batman, the animated series, concluded its original Fox Kids run in September of 1995, having established a standard for animated storytelling that the industry would spend the following decades attempting to approach. It was not the end of anything. It was the first movement of something much larger. The new Batman Adventures arrived in 1997, airing on Kids WB, a continuation of the animated Batman in a slightly revised visual style designed to align with the aesthetic of Superman. The animated series, which had begun the previous year, Conroy returned, as he would return for every subsequent production in the universe he had helped to build. The DCAO expanded laterally. Superman, Static Shock, the Zeta Project, each series connected to the others by shared continuity and, in Batman's case, by the occasional crossover that reminded the audience that this was not a collection of separate shows but a single world, watched from different angles. And then, in January of 1999, Bruce Timm and Paul Dini did something genuinely unexpected. They made Bruce Wayne old. Batman Beyond premiered on the 14th of that month, a future-set series in which Batman was not a young man at the peak of his powers, but a figure in his late 50s or early 60s, retired, living in Wayne Manor as a ghost of his former self. The manor had fallen into a state of gothic deterioration. Alfred was gone. The Batcave was sealed. Bruce Wayne moved through the enormous house with the careful economy of someone managing pain, physical pain, accumulated over decades of a career the human body was not designed to sustain, and something else, harder to name, the pain of a person who has given everything to a mission and is not certain, at the end, that everything was enough. The series transferred the mantle to Terry McGinnis, a teenager from the future Gotham, who came to the cave and found the equipment and, in circumstances of considerable personal desperation, took the suit and became the new Batman under the reluctant guidance of the old one. Paul Dini and Bruce Timm co-created the character. What they created around him, the texture of Bruce Wayne's retirement, the specific quality of his bitterness and his residual purpose, was the most psychologically complex portrait of the character the DSAO had yet produced. Conroy had a name for what Batman Beyond's Bruce Wayne was, drawn from the same source he had used for B. Tars's Bruce Wayne. If the animated Batman of the 1990s was Hamlet, driven by the ghost of a murdered father, caught between the self that existed and the self that the vow demanded, then the elderly Bruce Wayne of Batman Beyond was King Lear. Old, embittered, stripped of his power, living in a manner that had become a monument to a life fully spent and perhaps misspent, forced by circumstance to trust a young person he had no particular reason to trust and to accept that the mission he had carried alone for 4 years would have to be carried by someone else. The vocal performance Conroy gave for this character was one of the quiet masterpieces of his career. Not the Batman voice, the iconic, pressure-controlled, grief-fueled instrument that had defined the character for a decade, something older, worn at the edges. The same fundamental quality of absolute certainty, but surrounded now by fatigue in the way that a great building is surrounded by the evidence of weathering, the substance undiminished, the surface carrying every year it had stood. He played Bruce Wayne as a man who had used himself completely and was still, despite everything, present, still watching, still caring, even when caring was the last thing his manner suggested. This Bruce Wayne was DC.com's description of the performance, that it was arguably the greatest Bruce Wayne Conroy ever gave. Not the most iconic, the greatest, because it required him to play not the certainty of purpose, but the endurance of purpose, the willingness to keep going when the reasons had all been spent and what remained was simply the habit of showing up. In those same years, Kevin Conroy was navigating the kind of professional and personal terrain that does not generate headlines. The DCO had made him famous in a specific and unusual way, famous to millions of people who could identify the voice immediately and completely, who would hear it in any context and know exactly who it belonged to, but not famous in the way that resolves the ordinary financial and professional anxieties of an actor's life. He was the voice of Batman. He was not, in the industry's conventional accounting of such things, a star. He worked. He continued to work, in the recording booth and occasionally in front of a camera, building the body of work that was simultaneously one of the most extensive in the history of American voice acting and one of the least visible in the tabloid and premiere sense. He went to conventions. This became, over the years, a significant part of his professional life and an important dimension of his relationship with the audience that the animated series had created. The conventions were spaces in which the distance between the performer and the performance collapsed entirely, where the people who had grown up with his voice were in the same room as the man who owned it, and where the emotional investment those people carried toward a fictional character could be expressed directly to a real human being. Conroy was, by every account from every person who encountered him in these spaces, extraordinary. He had not merely patience, but genuine generosity, the kind that cannot be performed for long without the effort becoming visible. He made sure every fan who waited had a moment, He gave the moments fully, not as obligations dispatched, but as exchanges that he participated in, as completely as the person on the other side. He understood something that not every performer in his position understood, which is that the love people feel for a fictional character is real love, as real as any other, rooted as deeply, capable of sustaining a person through difficulty in the way that real relationships sustain people. He treated it accordingly. He also, in this period, did something that no one expected. In December of 1993, Batman, Mask of the Phantasm, was released in American cinemas. It had been rushed into production. The decision to give the animated Batman a theatrical feature had been made relatively late, which compressed the production timeline in ways that the creative team described after the fact with the diplomatic vagueness of people who had survived something and were not certain that describing it plainly would serve anyone well. The marketing campaign was almost non-existent. The film opened on Christmas Day in competition with significantly larger productions and did not perform at the box office in a way that anyone could describe as a success. None of this matters now. What matters is that Batman, Mask of the Phantasm is, by the consensus of critics, scholars, filmmakers, and fans who have had 30 years to evaluate the field, one of the finest Batman films ever made in any medium, live action or animated. Robert Pattinson, preparing for the Batman in 2022, cited it specifically as a model for how to capture the character's psychology. It is the film that demonstrated most completely what the animated series had been doing, that The Dark Knight could carry the full weight of adult storytelling, that grief and love and obsession and moral complexity could be rendered in animated form without losing a particle of their power. The film's story turned on a flashback, a younger Bruce Wayne before the cape and cowl, at the moment when he had begun his training but had not yet committed fully to the vow, when the decision was still, in some narrow technical sense, reversible. He had met a woman, Andrea Beaumont. He had fallen in love with her in the complete and serious way that a person who has been living entirely inside their grief falls in love when the grief briefly opens fully, without the ironic self-protection that most adults maintain. And the love had made the vow feel, for the first time, like a choice rather than an inevitability. A thing he had chosen, which meant a thing he could unchoose. The film asked, with genuine seriousness, whether Bruce Wayne could have walked away, whether the boy who made the promise in Crime Alley could have become a man who kept it differently, who honored the memory of his parents with a life rather than a vow, with love rather than war. It was the most humanizing portrait of the character that any screen adaptation had yet attempted, because it understood that what made Bruce Wayne genuinely tragic was not the sacrifice itself, but the possibility that the sacrifice was not required, that there was another path, that the night was a choice, and the choice had costs that the boy in Crime Alley could not have known to calculate. The culminating emotional moment of the film was a scene in a graveyard, Bruce Wayne in the rain, on his knees before his parents' headstone, asking them, directly, in the specific language of a prayer that has been rehearsed in private for years, to release him from the promise, because he had not, when he made it, understood that happiness was still possible, because Andrea had shown him that it was possible, because there was a life available to him that the vow was preventing. Please, I need it to be different now. I know I made a promise, but I didn't see this coming. I didn't count on being happy. Kevin Conroy recorded those lines in a studio in Los Angeles in 1993 in front of a microphone and the people whose job was to evaluate whether the performance was what the film required. He drew on something for those lines. He did not, in those early accounts, specify exactly what he drew on. But the director, Andrea Romano, who entered the recording booth when he finished and put her arms around him, said what she said. I don't know where you went emotionally, but it was beautiful. She knew I was drawing on something. The something was his father, the alcoholic, the man who had bled on the floor of a house in Westport, Connecticut, decades earlier in front of a boy who had no language for what he was seeing and no means of stopping it. The man with whom Kevin Conroy had, by his own description, a complicated relationship, which is to say, a relationship that contained love and damage in proportion that could not be neatly separated, that left the boy who experienced it carrying questions that the man never fully answered and the death never resolved. When Bruce Wayne asked his parents' graves, released him from the promise, he was asking the dead to give him permission to be. He was asking the grief to be enough, to have taken enough, cost enough, lasted long enough. He was asking whether the vow, made in the worst moment of a life, was allowed to be renegotiated by the person who had grown up on the other side of it. Kevin Conroy knew that question from the inside. He would say, at a convention in Nashville in 2017, that he had a complicated relationship with his parents throughout his life, and that, when he recorded that scene, he lost it. When he finished, there was silence in the studio, not the evaluative silence, people deciding whether the take was used. The other kind of silence, the kind that follows something true. Dana Delany, who played Andrea Beaumont and was present for part of the recording process, described the effect as chills. "You knew that there was truth happening," she said in a later interview. "It was really beautiful." Conroy himself, reflecting on the scene in the Vulture oral history of the animated series, gave the assessment that has become the most precise statement of his entire approach to the role. "That was the time I realized fully that you can't fake Batman. You can't just make a deep, husky sound with your voice. You have to base it in the pain of his childhood each time or it doesn't sound right. When I finished recording it, there was just a lot of silence in the studio." He called Batman, Mask of the Phantasm, not his most famous work, not his most successful by any commercial measure, his favorite. It was the project in which the performance was the most true, in which the distance between the character's grief and his own had been the smallest, and the work had required him to go to a place that he did not ordinarily permit himself to visit, and he had gone there, and it had been worth it, and Andrea Romano had held him when he came back. There is a footnote to the recording of Mask of the Phantasm that belongs here, because it is too perfectly constructed to leave out. Before recordings, it was standard practice for the actors to speak some lines into the microphone to set their voice levels. Conroy, warming up, would sometimes say the name of the voice director softly into the microphone, Andrea, in his full Batman voice. It became an in-joke. The low, resonant, completely committed Batman voice, speaking a single name quietly into the recording booth while the engineers adjusted levels. The cast found it funny. The crew found it funny. Romano found it funny. Paul Dini, writing the script for Mask of the Phantasm, needed a name for Batman's love interest, the woman whose presence in Bruce Wayne's past had come closest to breaking the vow. He remembered those. He remembered the in-joke, the low voice, the single name. The character became Andrea Beaumont, named after the voice director, by way of a joke that Kevin Conroy had been making every time he settled into the booth. The name Andrea, spoken in the Batman voice, soft and low, while the engineers found the level. A joke that became, without anyone intending it to, the name of the person who almost saved Bruce Wayne from himself. The September of 2001 arrived without warning. As September of 2001 arrived for everyone, Kevin Conroy was a New Yorker. He had been born in New York State, trained in New York City, built his career on the New York stage before the pull of film and television and the recording booth had taken him elsewhere. He had not lost his relationship with the city. When the towers came down, and the city began the specific and terrible process of accounting for what had happened and what came next, he went to volunteer. The volunteer line told him they did not need more tunnelers or diggers. He offered what he had instead, which was the ability to cook. He made his way to Nino's, an Italian restaurant located a few blocks from Ground Zero, which had been commandeered as a feeding station for the first responders and rescue workers, and volunteers cycling through the site in shifts around the clock. He worked in the kitchen. He cooked. He prepared hundreds of meals across multiple days. working alongside other volunteers who had each arrived with whatever skill they could offer, moving through the particular dazed purposefulness of a city that had been badly hurt and was trying, with great effort and incomplete success, to function. 3 nights into his time at Nino's, late at night, another volunteer asked him what he did for a living. The question was the kind of that gets asked in the specific atmosphere of collective emergency. The atmosphere in which the ordinary social distances have been suspended and people who would not ordinarily speak to each other are sharing a kitchen and a purpose and a grief. Conroy said he did voices, mostly. The other volunteer, an architect by day, as Conroy recalled it, recognized him immediately. He had been a fan of Batman, the animated series during its original run, he told the dining hall. Someone suggested that Conroy should prove it. He stepped out of the kitchen. The room was full of exhausted emergency service workers, police officers and firefighters and rescue personnel who had been working in conditions that no professional preparation fully equips a person for, who had been doing it for days, who were running on whatever reserves exist beneath the place where ordinary reserves run out. Some of them had been fans of the animated series. All of them, in some form, knew the voice. Kevin Conroy stood in the doorway of the dining area of a restaurant 3 blocks from Ground Zero in the city he had grown up in and delivered the line, "I am vengeance, I am the night, I am Batman." The room erupted, not politely, not with the restrained appreciation of people who had decided to be kind to a voice actor, had come to cook for them, with genuine, startled, releasing laughter and cheering, the specific release of people who had been holding something very tightly for a very long time and had been given, unexpectedly and completely without warning, permission to let go of it for a moment. Conroy described being humbled and deeply flattered. He used those specific words, humbled and deeply flattered, the phrasing of a man who had been moved by something and was trying to describe it accurately without overstatement. What had moved him, one suspects, was not the recognition itself, but what the recognition revealed, that the voice he had found in an audition room a decade earlier, drawn from his own pain and shaped by his own history and rooted in a fictional wound that rhymed with a real one, had given something to people, had become a thing that people carried with them into the worst circumstances of their lives, and that retained, even there, its ability to remind them of. He described it as the first time people there had smiled since the attacks. A man who had spent 30 years learning to protect himself behind a mask had stood in a doorway and said 3 sentences in a voice that was made of everything he had never been permitted to say. And the room, full of people who were full of everything they could not say, had laughed and cheered and felt for a moment less alone. Batman, without the costume, without the cape, without the grapple gun or the batarang or the Batmobile or any of the apparatus, just the voice, just the 30 years, just a man in a kitchen near Ground Zero who happened to have built, out of his own history of concealment and grief, the exact instrument that the moment required. The Arkham games arrived in 2009. Rocksteady Studios, a British developer working in close collaboration with Warner Bros., produced Batman: Arkham Asylum, a game in which the player inhabited Batman directly, moving through the corridors and grounds of Arkham Asylum on a night when the Joker had taken control of the facility, and every dangerous criminal Gotham had managed to incarcerate was loose in the dark. The story was written by Paul Dini, the same Paul Dini who had written Heart of Ice and The Mask of the Phantasm script, and a generation's worth of the finest Batman stories in any medium. The cast reunited the 4 BTS voice performers, Mark Hamill as the Joker, Arlene Sorkin as Harley Quinn, and Kevin Conroy as Batman. The game was, by the standards of its moment, a revelation, not because it was technically exceptional, though it was, but because it understood something about the character that most games had failed to grasp. That Batman was interesting not primarily as a combat mechanism, but as a psychological subject. That the most compelling thing about The Dark Knight was not the fighting, but the cost. The game placed the player inside a Batman who was visibly, physically, and psychologically pressured. A man at the peak of his capability who was nonetheless vulnerable to the Joker in ways that capability alone could not address, because the Joker's weapons were not brute force but manipulation, and the thing the Joker was manipulating was Bruce Wayne's relationship with his own mission. Conroy's performance in Arkham Asylum and in Arkham City 2 years later, and Arkham Knight 4 years after that, was of a piece with his animated work, but modulated for a different medium. The games required a Batman who was older than the animated series, had depicted him grittier, more battered, carrying more accumulated damage in the voice itself. The tone was lower, the control tighter, the moments of emotional exposure rarer and therefore more significant when they came. He voiced Batman and Thomas Wayne, the father, in flashback sequences, and in Arkham City he voiced Thomas Elliot, the villain Hush, whose obsession with Bruce Wayne took the form of surgically reconstructing his own face to look like Bruce's, which meant that Conroy, in that game, was voicing both the man and the villain wearing the man's face. Two voices from the same instrument, one true and one counterfeit, and the game's drama turned on the player's ability to recognize which was which. He had initially been reluctant to return for Arkham City. He felt that Arkham Asylum had concluded something, had been the right ending to a chapter, and that returning risked diluting the shape of it. Paul Dini's involvement in the sequel changed his calculation. He trusted the writer. He had trusted the writer for 20 years, and the trust had been consistently justified. He came back, and then he came back again for Arkham Knight to complete the trilogy, to voice a Batman who was older still, more damaged still, standing at the end of the road that began in Crime Alley and had run through every episode and every film and every game for 30 years, facing the end of the mission in the only way a man like Bruce Wayne could face it. The games became, along with the animated series and Mask of the Phantasm, the canonical record of what Kevin Conroy's Batman was. Not the totality of his work, 60 productions, 400 episodes, 30 years, but the works through which the character was most fully explored. The places where the dual identity, the moral code, the grief and the certainty, and the absolute commitment of the vow were examined with the most sustained attention. There is a detail about the BTAS recording process that Kevin Conroy mentioned in various interviews across the years, always with the same quality of remembered amusement that indicates something genuinely surprised him. During the first season, he was accosted one night near a bank in Los Angeles by a homeless man who had been watching him and recognized, after a moment, that he recognized the voice. "Are you Batman?" the man asked. Conroy confirmed that he was the voice of Batman. "Yes." The man thought about this for a moment. "I knew it," he said. "There is no particular moral attached to this story." Conroy told it without attaching one, simply as an incident, a moment of unexpected recognition in the ordinary circumstances of an ordinary evening. But it illuminates something about what voice acting at his level accomplishes that other kinds of performance do not. The voice travels further than the face. It enters spaces the face cannot reach. It arrives at night, through speakers, in the dark rooms where people are most themselves, where the performance of daytime has been set aside, and the actual self, with its actual griefs and its actual longings, is the only thing left. The homeless man near the bank in Los Angeles knew the voice. The exhausted firefighters in the Nino's dining room knew the voice. The children who had watched the series in the 1990s and were now adults with children of their own still knew the voice, recognized it in their bodies before their minds had processed the identification. The voice had gotten into people, not in the superficial way of a recognizable sound, but in the deeper way of something that had been present at formative moments, that had been in the room when something was being decided about who a person was and what they believed and what they were prepared to stand for. Kevin Conroy had spent 30 years with his voice doing that work, quietly in recording booths, without the apparatus of stardom that surrounds the kind of fame most people aspire to. He was not photographed at premieres. His face was not on billboards. He moved through conventions and recording sessions and the ordinary geography of a professional life with the self-possession of a person who had long since made peace with the specific shape of his own success, who understood that the work was the thing, and the work was enough, and the millions of people who carried his voice with them into their lives were the audience that mattered. He had not yet told them who he was. That was coming. 5 months before he died, he sat down with an artist named J. Bone and a letterer named Aditya Bidikar, and he began to write the thing he had been carrying for 30 years. Not about Batman, about himself. There is a particular kind of courage that does not announce itself. It does not arrive in a moment of crisis when the adrenaline makes the decision for you and the body moves before the mind has time to object. It does not come with the structure of emergency, the burning building, the collapsing bridge, the situation in which the alternative to courage is so immediately terrible that the choice is not really a choice at all. This other kind of courage arrives in stillness, in the quiet of a room where nothing is on fire, where nothing is falling, where the only thing at stake is the truth of who you are, and whether you are prepared, at last, to let the world hold it. Kevin Conroy wrote a comic book in the spring of 2022. He was 66 years old. He had been the voice of Batman for 30 years. He had a husband named Vaughn, whose existence the world did not yet know about, because Kevin Conroy had spent his entire public life keeping his private life private, not as a strategy, not as a calculated image management decision, but as the deeply embedded habit of a man who had learned early and at considerable cost that the world was not always safe for the truth of what he was. He sat down with J. Bone, who would illustrate, and Aditya Bidikar, who would letter, and he wrote 11 pages. He called them Finding Batman. DC Comics published them in the DC Pride 2022 anthology. In June of that year, as the closing story of the collection, placed last deliberately, positioned as the note the anthology ended on, the thing the reader carried out of the book and into the rest of their evening. The story was prefaced with a content warning, not because it contained graphic imagery, but because it contained something that required a different kind of preparation. The truth. Specifically, the truth as Kevin Conroy had lived it. The slurs, the losses, the epidemic, the decades of concealment. The editors who assembled the anthology understood that the stories preceding Finding Batman, the joyful, colourful, exuberant celebrations of queer DC characters that made up the majority of the collection, were one kind of pride, and that Conroy's story was another kind. The kind that celebrates not despite the dark times but because of them, because of the strength found on the other side. J. Bone illustrated the story in black and white with a palette of cool greys, deliberately muted against the rainbow of pages the reader had been moving through. One splash of colour, a single word, rendered in stark red letters, in a panel that depicted the moment Conroy's brother called him, the word that his brother called him. The red was the only colour in the entire story. It was the most deliberate artistic decision in the book, and it was correct. Some words are not grey. Some words have been doing damage for so long that they have their own colour, and it is the colour of the thing that has been done. What Conroy wrote across those 11 pages was the story this documentary has been following from the beginning. The Irish Catholic household. The alcoholic father. The night he found him bleeding. The specific image that lodged in a child's memory and did not move. The image he would draw on 3 decades later in a recording booth in Los Angeles when he needed to know what Bruce Wayne felt at his parents' grave. The strict Catholic schools. The dawning and terrifying understanding in the 1960s and 70s of what he was, and the equally swift understanding of what the world around him thought about what he was. He wrote about putting on his mask, not Batman's mask, his own. The one he built from the materials available, the professional manner, the theatrical skill, the careful social performance of a man who had decided that the world was not yet ready to hold the version of him that was actually true. He wrote about it without self-pity and without anger, in the tone of a person describing a weather system they lived inside for a long time, with the particular clarity that distance eventually provides. He wrote about the 1980s, about the AIDS epidemic as he experienced it, not as an abstraction or a historical event, but as the systematic removal of people he knew and loved from the world, in a period when the larger culture's response ranged from indifference to active hostility. He wrote about attending funerals, about the specific grief of a loss that the world refuses to grieve with you, the grief that has to be performed in private, folded into the professional mask, carried on the commute and into the audition room, and back out again. He wrote about the roles he lost when whispers reached the right ears. He wrote about the slur his brother used, the single red word in the otherwise grey story. He wrote about the call from his agent, the animated series, the audition room, the question about the Dark Knight. And then he wrote the line that was the reason for all of it, the line that made the story not a document of suffering but a story of finding, the line that connected his 30 years of concealment to the voice that emerged from them. As a gay boy growing up in the 1950s and 60s in a devout Catholic family, I had grown adept at concealing parts of myself. And then, on the final page, his description of the audition moment, my heart pulsed. I felt my face flush. My breath grew deeper. I began to speak and a voice I didn't recognize came out. It was a throaty, husky, rumbling sound that shook my body. It seemed to roar from 30 years of frustration, confusion, denial, love, yearning. I felt Batman rising from deep within. The parallel that Conroy drew in. Finding Batman between his own double life and Bruce Wayne's is not a metaphor. This requires emphasis because it is easy to read it as one, as the kind of elegantly constructed analogy that a skilled writer finds between their own experience and a fictional character's, true in a poetic sense, if not a literal one. But Conroy was not writing poetry, he was writing autobiography, and the parallel he drew was structural, not figurative. Bruce Wayne concealed himself because the world was not safe for what he actually was. He built a mask, charming, vacuous, publicly visible, and wore it every day so that the thing beneath could do what it needed to do without interference from a world that would not have permitted it. The mask cost him everything that Bruce Wayne might otherwise have had: love, rest, peace, the ordinary human experience of being known. He paid that cost because the alternative, a world in which the protection the Dark Knight provided was unavailable, was worse. Kevin Conroy concealed himself because the world was not safe for what he actually was. He built a mask, professional, competent, publicly visible, and wore it every day so that the thing beneath could survive without being destroyed by a world that had demonstrated, clearly and repeatedly, that it was capable of destroying it. The mask cost him what it always costs, the full experience of being known. He paid that cost because the alternative, the roles lost, the slurs, the family's silence, the epidemic's indifference, was what happened when the mask came down without consent. The Batman voice, the thing that emerged in the audition room when the right question was asked, was the first version of his truth that the world was permitted to hear. Not Kevin Conroy's truth, labeled and attributed and vulnerable. Batman's truth, filtered through a fictional character, projected into a fictional city, contained within the safety of a story that everyone understood was not real, but made of entirely real material, made of the frustration and the confusion and the denial and the love and the yearning that had no other container. The voice was the mask coming off, just not yet all the way. Finding Batman was published in June of 2022. The response was immediate and vast, and of a quality that Conroy described in a video he posted to social media a few days after publication as overwhelming. He sat in front of a camera and thanked the people who had written to him, who had told him that the story had reached them, had found something in them that had been waiting to be found. He thanked Jay, Bone and Aditya Bidikar and the DC editors who had supported the work. He said, with the precision of a man who understood the difference between words and the things that words try to carry. Whenever you share something that personal, you risk, and you all made that risk so worthwhile. The risk was real. He had been carrying the story for 66 years, which is a long time to carry something without putting it down. Sharing it in public, in a comic, in a medium that would reach the same audience that had spent 3 decades hearing his voice as Batman, was the act of finally, after everything, letting the mask and the face tell the same story. DC Comics, after his death, made Finding Batman freely available to read on their website, which means that the story is still there, that the 11 pages are still in the world, still speaking, still doing the thing that Conroy wrote them to do, still finding in the people who read them whatever it is, they are waiting to be found. Bruce Wayne in the DC animated universe crossed into something new in 2019, not in animation, in live action for the first time, the first and only time Kevin Conroy would appear as the character in a form that put his face on screen alongside his voice. The CW's Arrowverse, a sprawling connected universe of DC superhero television series, had been building toward a crossover event called Crisis on Infinite Earths since the mid-2010s. The event drew on one of the most significant storylines in DC Comics history, a 1985 limited series in which the DC multiverse was destroyed and rebuilt, in which heroes from across parallel Earths converged on a single catastrophic moment. For the television adaptation, the showrunners made a decision that the audience who had grown up with the animated series received with the specific quality of emotion that comes from waiting a long for something you did not know you were waiting for. They cast Kevin Conroy as Bruce Wayne, not the Bruce Wayne of the main Arrowverse Earth, the Bruce Wayne of Earth 989, an alternate universe version of the character who had lived a different version of the story. This Bruce Wayne was older. He had broken his moral code. He had killed. The long confrontation with Gotham's criminals, sustained across decades, had eventually produced the outcome that the code was designed to prevent. A Batman who had stopped believing that restraint was the answer, who had taken the other road, who had eliminated the Joker and Two-Face and most of the Rogues Gallery, and had fought Superman himself, and had won that fight at a cost that had left him confined to a mechanical exoskeleton, the accumulated damage of a life fully and destructively spent, now visible in the machinery required to hold him upright. He appeared on screen in the Batwoman episode of the crossover. He was found by characters from other Earths who came looking for his cooperation, and found instead a man who had made choices he could not undo, and who had the particular stillness of someone who had run out of the capacity for regret. Conroy played him with complete authority, with the ease of a person returning to a role they have inhabited for 30 years, and finding, in this darker version of it, a range they had not previously been asked to explore. The Earth 989 Bruce Wayne was what happened when the vow was kept without the code, when the night continued but the rules that gave it meaning were discarded. He died in the crossover. The character, not the man. Kevin Conroy stood in front of a camera in a costume that referenced Kingdom Come, and delivered the performance with the same attention to truth that had characterized every version of the character he had ever voiced. And then the character died, and Conroy went back to doing what he had always done, appearing at conventions, voicing the character in animation and games, keeping the faith with a body of work that was by then 3 decades deep. He was 63 years old. He had 3 more years. The last recording, Rocksteady Studios, the developers who had made the Arkham trilogy, who had done the Batman games that demonstrated most fully what Conroy's voice could do in an interactive medium, was working on a new game, Suicide Squad, Kill the Justice League. The premise was ambitious and, for longtime fans of Rocksteady's Batman work, emotionally complicated. The Justice League had been brainwashed, and the Suicide Squad, the most reliable villains available, had to stop them. Batman was among the brainwashed heroes, which meant that Conroy's Batman appeared in the game not as the protagonist, but as the threat. A dark, Night operating without the code, serving the brainwashing rather than fighting it. The recording sessions for the game were conducted before Conroy's diagnosis. He recorded his final lines as Batman, without knowing they were his final lines as Batman, without the ceremony or the deliberateness that a person would bring to a conclusion they knew was a conclusion. The work was done in the manner of a professional who has been doing the work for 30 years, which is to say with full attention and no particular sentimentality, because sentimentality is the enemy of the kind of truth the work requires. The game was released in February of 2024. Kevin Conroy had been dead for 15 months. His voice, in the game, continued to do what his voice had always done. It landed with the authority and the weight, and the specific quality of inhabited truth that had characterized it since the audition in 1991. The character he voiced was a corrupted version of the hero, a Batman operating outside the code, weaponized against the city he had spent his life protecting. But the voice was his voice. The instrument was the instrument he had built from Juilliard and Shakespeare, and the AIDS epidemic, and the Catholic schools, and the divided apartment, and the complicated father, and the 30 years of concealment and the audition room, and the ground zero kitchen, and the mask of the Phantasm recording booth, and Finding Batman and everything else. The voice was still there, still doing the work, still, in the most literal sense available, guarding Gotham after the man who owned it was gone. In November of 2023, a little over a year after his death, the Batman Arkham trilogy was released on the Nintendo Switch, a compilation of Asylum, City, and Night, making the 3 games available on a handheld console for the first time. Players who completed Arkham Asylum on the new platform were shown, when the credits concluded, a screen that had not been in any previous version of the game. A drawing, black and white, Gotham City's skyline, the dark deco architecture, the setbacks and the ornamental details of the buildings, the scale of the thing, the city that Bruce Timm had drawn on black paper in 1991, and that Paul Dini had filled with stories, and that Andrea Romano had peopled with voices, and that Kevin Conroy had given its defining sound. The city itself, rendered in the aesthetic of the world he had spent 3 decades inhabiting, and in the upper left corner of the image, in a font that was warm rather than cold, in letters that did not announce themselves, in memory of Kevin Conroy. Gotham City, remembering him in its own language, the city that existed because of a boy in Crime Alley and a writer named Bill Finger and an artist named Bob Kane and a generation of creators who refused to let the character become less than it could be. That city, the imaginary city drawn on black paper, using its own skyline as a memorial, he had given it a voice. It gave him back a monument. There is a question that runs underneath everything in this episode, and this chapter is the right place to ask it plainly. What was the relationship between Kevin Conroy and Batman? Not in the professional sense, that is documented and verifiable and runs to 60 productions and 30 years, and the longest tenure in the history of the character. In the other sense, the sense that Finding Batman was trying to articulate, the sense in which the voice and the character were not employer and employee, not artist and medium, not even the conventional relationship between a performer and a role. Conroy answered this question himself. In the final year of his life, in the 11 pages of that comic, he answered it with the precision of someone who had been thinking about the answer for a very long time and had finally found the frame large enough to hold it. Bruce Wayne was a man who built a mask because the world was not safe for what he actually was. The mask protected him and protected others, cost him everything that a full life might have offered. He wore it because the alternative, a world without the protection the mask made possible, was worse than the cost. Kevin Conroy was a man who built a mask because the world was not safe for what he actually was. The mask protected him and protected what he needed to protect and cost him what it always costs. He wore it because the alternative was what he had already experienced. The slurs, the losses, the epidemic, the silence, of a family that could not hold the truth of what he was. The Batman voice was the moment the masks became the same mask, when the fictional character's concealment and the real man's concealment recognized each other, not as parallel structures running in separate lanes, but as the same structure inhabited simultaneously, drawing from the same source. The voice that roared from 30 years of frustration and confusion and denial and love and yearning was the voice of both of them. It belonged to Bruce Wayne. It belonged to Kevin Conroy. It was the sound of two men in two worlds, telling the truth in the only way available to them at the time. The animated series was a safe container. Batman's grief projected into Gotham City, filtered through a fictional mythology, held within the conventions of a story that everyone understood was not real. Could be heard without demanding anything from the person hearing it. It could reach people in their dark rooms at night and give them something they needed, without asking them to acknowledge where it came from or what it cost to produce. That is what great art does. It gives the audience the truth without exposing the artist to the vulnerability that truth creates. Kevin Conroy gave millions of people Batman's truth for 30 years and held his own truth in private, and in June of 2022, he sat down with Jay Bone and Aditya Bidikar, and finally at 66, gave them both. The world received it. The response was overwhelming. The risk was made worthwhile. 5 months later, he died. There is a detail about Kevin Conroy's birthday that the people who assembled the cast of Batman, the animated series, did not know when they made their decisions, because it is not the kind of detail that comes up in casting meetings. Kevin Conroy was born on the 30th of November. Ephraim Zimbalist Jr., who voiced Alfred Pennyworth, Bruce Wayne's butler, the man who knew the secret and kept it and believed in it, even on the days when Bruce Wayne himself did not, was also born on the 30th of November. Batman and his most faithful keeper of the secret, sharing a birthday. The man behind the mask and the man who tended the mask, born on the same day, discovered in the same recording booth, giving voice to the same story from different angles. It is either coincidence or it is the universe occasionally demonstrating that it has a sense of composition. Given everything else, it feels presumptuous to assume it is coincidence. Everything that endures does so in two registers simultaneously. There is the register of the record, the documented, verifiable, innumerable legacy that can be listed and sourced and cited. The 60 productions, the 400 episodes, the 30 years, the daytime Emmys and the convention halls, and the critical consensus and the tribute screen in the Arkham trilogy that used Gotham City's own skyline as a memorial. These things exist. They can be counted. They constitute the formal account of what Kevin Conroy and his Batman, and that formal account is, by any standard applied to any performer in any medium, remarkable. And then there is the other register, the one that cannot be counted, the one that exists in the dark rooms where people are most themselves, where the ordinary performance of daytime has been set aside, and the actual self, with its actual griefs and its actual questions, is all that remains. The register in which a voice that was made of 30 years of concealment and grief and love and yearning entered the lives of millions of people and gave them something they could not have named in advance, but recognized immediately as something they needed. The formal record and the unquantifiable truth, both are the legacy, and they cannot be separated because one without the other is incomplete. The record without the truth is just a list, and the truth without the record is just a feeling that dissolves when the lights come on. Kevin Conroy left both. The 10th of November 2022 was a Thursday. It was a morning, presumably, in the way that all days are mornings before they are anything else. The particular quality of light through a window, the specific sounds of a city going about the business of continuing, the ordinary texture of a day that has not yet become what it is going to become. Kevin Conroy was at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York City. He had been diagnosed with intestinal cancer. The diagnosis had been recent. The battle described afterward as short. which means the disease had moved quickly in the way that some diseases move quickly, without the prolonged negotiation that allows a person to arrange their leave take with the deliberateness they might prefer. He died on that Thursday. He was 66 years old. He was survived by his husband, Von C. Williams, whose name the world learned for the first time in the official statement that DC Comics released the following day, because Conroy had kept his private life private to the last, and the marriage had been his own, held outside the industry's reach, known to those who knew him and not to those who only thought they did. He was survived by his sister Tricia Conroy and his brother Tom Conroy, whose name carries the weight of the story that Finding Batman told and does not need to be annotated here. DC's entertainment statement confirmed the cause of death. Warner Brothers Animation issued their own statement. And then, across the following hours and days, the people who had known him began to speak. Mark Hamill spoke first, or nearly first, in the manner of someone who had been thinking about what he would say for years, without wanting to have to say it. The relationship between Mark Hamill's Joker and Kevin Conroy's Batman is one of the great creative partnerships in the history of popular entertainment, not because it was celebrated or widely publicized during its peak, but because of its specific, sustained, irreplaceable quality. They were, in Hamill's own description, like Laurel and Hardy, a pairing so precisely matched that the removal of either half did not merely diminish the partnership, but eliminated it entirely. The Joker without Conroy's Batman was a different Joker, one operating in a different universe, playing by different rules. The chemistry was specific to both of them, and Hamill knew it and had said on more than one occasion that he was not certain he could continue playing the character if Conroy's Batman was not on the other side of the exchange. What Hamill said Conroy died was this: Kevin was perfection. He was one of my favorite people on the planet, and I loved him like a brother. He truly cared for the people around him. His decency shone through everything he did. Every time I saw or spoke with him, my spirits were elevated. Kevin was a brilliant actor. For several generations, he has been the definitive Batman. It was one of those perfect scenarios where they got the exact right guy for the exact right part, and the world was better for it. The phrase that carries the most weight in that statement is not the one about perfection, or the one about brotherhood, or the one about elevated spirits. It is the last one. The world was better for it. Not the animated series was better for it. Not the Batman mythology was better. The world. The actual world. The one in which people live and work and carry their griefs and find, in the dark rooms where they are most themselves, the things that help them continue. Paul Dini, who had written the stories and trusted Conroy to inhabit them for 3 decades, said, Kevin brought a light with him everywhere, whether in the recording booth giving it his all or feeding first responders during September 11th, or making sure every fan who ever waited for him had a moment with their Batman, a hero in every sense of the word. The construction of that sentence is deliberate. The recording booth, the ground zero kitchen, the convention hall, 3 locations, 3 kinds of presence, 3 ways of showing up for the people who needed you to show up. Dini was not making a rhetorical point. He was making a factual one. Kevin Conroy was the same person in all 3 places, the same attention, the same generosity, the same absolute commitment to giving what he had to the moment that required it. The mask and the face, telling the same story. Andrea Romano, who had cast him and directed him and held him in a recording booth in 1993 when he came back from somewhere that cost him something, said, Kevin was far more than an actor whom I had the pleasure of casting and directing. He was a dear friend for 30+ years, whose kindness and generous spirit knew no boundaries. Kevin's warm heart, delightfully deep laugh, and pure love of life will be with me forever. Tara Strong, who had voiced Batgirl and Harley Quinn alongside him, and who had been in the recording booth on the other side of the microphone from his Batman in the Arkham games, said simply, there will never be another. He is Batman. not was, is. The present tense, deliberate because the voice is still there. In the recordings, in the games, in the 400 episodes, in the 15 films, in the memory of every person who has ever heard it in the dark and felt the thing it was designed to make them feel. The past tense would suggest that the voice ended when the man did. It did not. The voice is in the world. It will continue to be in the world for as long as the world holds recording, which is to say, for as long as can meaningfully be imagined. Warner Brothers Animation's formal statement used the language of institutional tribute, but arrived at something true despite its formality. His iconic performance of Batman will forever stand among the greatest portrayals of the Dark Knight in any medium. In any medium. Not in animation, not in voice acting. In any medium. Standing alongside Bale and Keaton and Affleck and Pattinson and every other actor who has put on the cowl in any context, for any audience, in any era. The voice, the instrument built from Juilliard and Grief and Shakespeare, and a divided apartment and 30 years of concealment and an audition room where a woman asked the right question, standing alongside all of it and, in the honest estimation of the studio that produced the work, surpassing it. Batman did not stop when Kevin Conroy died. This requires saying plainly, because it is both obviously true and strangely important. The character who debuted in Detective Comics issue 27 in March of 1939 has outlived every person who has ever worked on him. He outlived Bob Kane, who died in 1998. He outlived Bill Finger, who died in 1974 without ever seeing his name in a credit. He outlived the editors and artists and writers of a dozen distinct eras. He will continue outliving everyone who works on him, because that is the nature of mythological characters. They are larger than any contribution, and they continue. New actors voice him, new artists draw him, new writers find new angles on the wound and the vow and the mask and the code. The character continues to be tested and examined and dramatized because the character contains a question that has not yet been fully answered and perhaps cannot be. The question of whether a person who has dedicated their entire life to a mission that can never be completed is heroic or tragic, and whether the distinction between those two things matters as much as we tend to assume. But for a generation, for the specific generation of people who encountered Batman through the animated series and its expansions, through the Arkham games, through the DCO, the character's definitive sound is Kevin Conroy's voice. This is not nostalgia, though it contains nostalgia. It is the deeper thing that nostalgia is often mistaken for, the indelible impression of a formative encounter, the shape that something takes in you when you encounter it at the right age, in the right circumstance, with the right quality of attention. The shape does not change when new versions of the thing appear. It remains. The new versions are evaluated against it. DC. Com articulated this with the precision of people who had been thinking about it for 30 years. If you can hear Kevin's voice when you read a Batman comic, that is a good Batman comic. The voice became the standard, not for the performance, for the character itself, the benchmark against which the written word is evaluated. If the dialogue sounds right in his voice, it is right. If it does not, something is missing. This is the definition of having defined something, not of having played it well, of having given it its essential nature, the sound without which it is a different thing, lesser, incomplete. Bruce Wayne's legacy in the DC animated universe was given its most complete statement in Batman Beyond, an elderly man in a deteriorating manner, having given everything the mission demanded, and then a little more, forced by circumstance to accept that the mission would continue without him. The mantle passed to Terry McGinnis, young, impulsive, brilliant, shaped by his own version of the founding wound. And Bruce Wayne watched from Wayne Manor as the work continued under different hands. He guided, he advised. He was difficult, in the way that people who have been the best at something for very long are sometimes difficult about watching someone else do it differently. But he continued. He showed up. He kept faith with the thing even after the thing no longer required his direct participation. It is not a perfect parallel to Kevin Conroy's relationship with Batman after his death, because Conroy did not choose the timing of his exit and had no opportunity to watch the work continue from a distance. But there is something in Batman Beyond's portrait of Bruce Wayne, the aged figure whose voice and judgment and accumulated wisdom remain central to the story even as the physical embodiment of the mission passes to someone younger, that echoes forward to what Conroy's legacy actually is. The voice is the guidance now. The recordings are the manner every new actor who takes on the role, in any medium, for any audience, exists in a tradition that Conroy's 30 years established. They are Terry McGinnis to his Bruce Wayne. They have the suit, and they have the training, and they have the extraordinary inheritance of a mythology that Conroy helped define, and they move through it with the knowledge, whether or not they state it explicitly, that the standard was set by a man who built the instrument from grief and wore it for 30 years without complaint. Several actors who have played Batman in the years since Conroy established the standard have spoken about his influence in terms that confirm what the benchmark means in practice. Robert Pattinson studied Mask of the Phantasm before the Batman. Ben Affleck was raised on the animated series. The live-action Batman of the past 3 decades grew up hearing the voice, and hearing it shaped what they understood the character to be. And that understanding is in the performances, whether or not the influence is acknowledged. Kevin Conroy never saw himself as a gatekeeper. He was characteristically generous about other actors' interpretations of the role, even when pressed by convention audience who wanted him to defend the primacy of his own version. He understood that the character was large enough to hold many interpretations, and that his particular version was particular, shaped by his history and his instrument, and the specific moment in the character's mythology when he arrived. He was not the only Batman, he was his Batman. And his Batman was the one that endured. Bill Finger died in January of 1974. He had spent 35 years writing Batman, creating the name, the costume, the origin, the supporting cast, the tone, the rules, and died in a one-room apartment in the Bronx in financial difficulty, without a single official credit to his name. The character he had built was appearing on television, in films, in merchandise that generated revenue he never saw. His contributions were known to comics historians and to the people within the industry who had watched him work, but they were not acknowledged by the corporation that owned the copyright, which had a contractual obligation to give sole credit to Bob, and was honoring that obligation with complete institutional indifference to the question of whether it was just. DC Entertainment officially recognized Bill Finger as Batman's co-creator in September of 2015, 41 years after his death. The credit has appeared in Batman media since 2016. Batman created by Bob Kane with Bill Finger, a formulation that is better than nothing and considerably less than what accuracy would require, which is Batman created by Bob Kane and Bill Finger. But that is the formulation that was negotiated, and it is the one that appears. Finger's granddaughter, Athena Finger, was central to the campaign for official recognition. She had grown up knowing that her grandfather had built something and received nothing for it, and she spent years making the case to the people, with the contractual authority to change that. And eventually the case was heard. The recognition came. It was incomplete, and it was late, but it came. And it means that the name Bill Finger now appears in the same cultural record as the character he created, which is even if it is not everything. The parallel between Bill Finger's erasure and Kevin Conroy's decades of concealment is not a parallel that either man drew explicitly, because the circumstances are different, important ways. Finger was erased by an institute that had a financial interest in the erasure. Conroy concealed himself in response to a culture that had demonstrated the consequences of visibility. The mechanisms are different. The experience of being the person who built something essential and was not fully acknowledged for building it, of being present in the work without being seen in it, runs through both stories like a current. Bill Finger's name is in the credits now. Kevin Conroy's story is in the world now. in 11 pages of black and white panels with one red word and a final splash in which a voice that roared from 30 years of everything finally found its source and named it. Both of them, in the end, found their credit. Both of them, in the end, were seen. There are things that outlast the people who made them in ways that nothing else does. Not buildings. Buildings fall. Eventually, in the long run of time that makes even the most durable architecture temporary. Not institutions. Institutions transform themselves beyond recognition, shedding their original purposes and personnel across generations until the continuity of the name is the only connection to the founding. Not even ideas exactly. Ideas mutate as they pass through minds, changing shape with each new host, till the original formulation is barely visible beneath the accumulated interpretations. Voices are different. A voice, recorded, is the closest thing to permanence that a person can leave. It is not the person. It is not the full complexity of the human being who produced it, with all their private history, and their contradictions, and their specific way of moving through a room. But it is more than a representation. It is a trace, a physical impression, literally, in the original recording, of the air that moved through a specific body on a specific day in a specific room, shaped by everything that body had experienced and learned and survived and loved and lost. The recording is not the person, but the recording contains something of that nothing else does. Kevin Conroy's voice is in the world. It will continue to be in the world. The children who are watching Batman, the animated series right now, whose parents have put the series on because they grew up with it and want to share it, or who found it on their own through a streaming service or a recommendation, are hearing that voice for the first time. They do not know yet what it will mean to them. They do not know that the man who owned it spent 30 years carrying things he could not say and built an instrument from those things, and then stepped into a recording booth in 1991 and found, in a fictional wound that rhymed with his real one, the container his grief had always needed. They just know the voice, and something in them recognizes, not as a character, not as a hero, as someone who understands what it means to live behind a mask, which is where this story began. Bruce Wayne is still in Gotham City. He is still in Crime Alley, in the panel that Bill Finger wrote in November of 1939. The boy on his knees, the promise in the dark, the vow that would take his entire life to honor without ever being completed. He is still in the graveyard, in the rain, begging his parents to release him from something he made before he understood what he was agreeing to. He is still in the cave, in the elderly isolation of Batman Beyond, watching a younger man carry the mantle he can no longer carry and finding, in that watching, a form of continuation he did not expect. He will continue to be in those places. The character is permanent in the way that mythological characters are permanent. Not immortal, exactly, but embedded deeply enough in the culture that their removal would leave a wound the shape of their absence. Gotham City without Batman is not Gotham City. Dark Alley without the boy is not the Dark Alley. The crime that started everything is only the crime it is because of what it made. Kevin Conroy is in those places too now. Not as a visible presence, his name does not appear in the credits of Detective Comics 27 and the original animation cells of Batman. The animated series do not bear his signature, but in the voice on every recording, in the standard that every subsequent performance is measured against, in the generation of people who carry his Batman with them as the definitional version of the character, he is there, the mask and the face, finally telling the same story. The voice that roared from 30 years of frustration and confusion and denial and love and yearning, still moving through the world, still, in the most precise sense of the word, present. Kevin Conroy was born on the 30th of November, 1955, in Westbury, New York. He died on the 10th of November, 2022, at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York City. In between, he was the voice of Batman for 30 years, the longest tenure in the history of the character, in any medium, among any actor, in any form. the character has taken since Bill Finger wrote the origin in 2 pages in November of 1939. He voiced Batman in 60 productions. He voiced Batman at Ground Zero. He voiced Batman in a recording booth where he wept without apologizing for. He voiced Batman in conventions across 3 decades for every person who waited, giving each of them a full moment with the character they love. He voiced Batman in the final year of his life in a game that was released after he was gone, his voice continuing to guard the city he had spent 30 years protecting. He also, 5 months before he died, sat down with an artist and a letterer and wrote 11 pages about himself, about the gay boy in the Catholic household and the alcoholic father and the AIDS epidemic and the mask he built and the mask he wore and the audition room where the right question was asked and something came out that roared from 30 years of everything he had been carrying. He called it Finding Batman. He found more than that, and so the story rests here, friend. 2 men, one fictional, one real, both carrying wounds they did not choose, both building masks from the materials available, both finding, in the end, that the mask and the face were always the same thing, that what they were hiding was not separate from what they were offering, but was precisely the source of it, that the voice that protected Gotham was made of the same grief that needed protection. Bill Finger wrote the origin in 2 pages. Kevin Conroy gave it its voice in 1 audition. Between them, across 80 years and 30 years respectively, they gave the world something it did not know it needed until it arrived. If this story stayed with you, leave a small note below. I will be here again with another life, another long night, another quiet hour. Until then, this has been Mr. K. Law. Sleep well.